All right, Claire, are you ready to enlighten us?
I sure am. Absolutely.
Looks like a good group. Some names I remember and some I don't. It's good to have new people on board. Well, good morning, everyone. We're right at 11 o'clock, so in interest of everyone's time and CEUs, we'll get started without delay. I'm Scott Anderson. I'm with Mental Health and Addictions in Columbus. When I'm in my office, right now I'm in my living room in Westerville. Um, this has been very disruptive, I'm sure, for everyone involved. So we very much appreciate you coming online and I guess doing what we're going to be doing for some time. It's really fun to see people as we started in this process come on board and grow. And this is a great example. Claire Spada works for the Lake Jaga Recovery Center and the problem gambling prevention specialist. She has 12 years of experience working in prevention in varying capacities around Ohio. She's a Ohio certified prevention specialist. She has a passion for educating others on issues that can greatly impact their lives, including drug, alcohol, and gambling prevention, coping with emotions in a positive way, and empowering young people in leadership roles. In her current role, Claire solely focuses on expanding problem gambling education, awareness, and screening into organizations that may already provide services to vulnerable populations such as college-age students, senior citizens, middle-aged and high school students, as well as those who have a history of drug and alcohol abuse or mental health concerns. She believes that with dedication and focus, we can grow our reach within our community and looks forward to developing future partnerships and collaborations across the state. So without any more from me, I'll turn this over to Claire Spada, and we have a poll that we're going to start with and try to figure out where everybody's at. So I'll turn it over to Claire.
Awesome. So I am going to start by trying to share my screen. We'll see how that goes. Let's see here. Oops. Can you all see it?
Yes, it looks good.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I don't know if you can see me or not in like a top corner or something like that, but I am in a group room right now. I don't have a webcam on my actual computer, so I have to look up in order to see what I'm presenting. So if you're looking at me, you're probably just going to be seeing my chin the entire time, so I apologize. But I am working as just a problem gambling prevention specialist. So that is my entire role, and I do it for both Lake and Geauga counties. So I have two different boards that I report to, and it's always an interesting process. So I am here to kind of share some of my knowledge about things that I've just done in prevention as a whole that have been related to problem gambling. And I feel like in order to know where people are at, I did have a couple of poll questions so that way I could see where everybody is at. Are you working in prevention, treatment? Are you working with young people? Are you working with in the justice system? So I don't know if I can see those poll questions. I hope that they pop up. But please go ahead and answer those so that way I can make sure I'm just speaking and tailoring my presentation. Oh, they're there. Okay, so it looks like most people have answered the questions that I have, and it looks like the majority of people here are doing a lot of treatment, a lot of other, which is such a big category. I do see a lot of people are working in the substance or mental health treatment agencies. A lot of people working with adults, some youth, some elderly. Okay, good. That's just helpful for me, so that way when I'm speaking, I can definitely make sure I'm addressing people within those different realms. So thank you for that information. Okay, cool. So let's kind of jump into it. So the presentation that I'm giving to you is actually one that I did in conjunction with one of my old supervisors. I don't want to see these poll results again. Okay, so one of my old supervisors, Lauren Monk, who works for CHC Addiction Services, when I had worked with her, we provided youth-led prevention services, and so we created this together from a lot of our knowledge of working with youth. Currently in my role, I do a lot more work with adults, so this is going to be some information that you can use with either population, and I just wanted to make sure I gave her credit because we definitely partnered on this together. So overall, our objectives, ideally by the end of this, you're going to be able to learn how to integrate some gambling prevention and education into drug and alcohol services. We're going to be taking a look at 3 different interactive activities that you can utilize to start great conversations. And you will be ideally gaining knowledge in just how to promote that programming in the community. For those of us who have done problem gambling services before, it can sometimes be a hard sell. And I hopefully will give you some tools to be able to help you connect that to different sectors and different populations and be able to promote yourself and your services and why you're valuable. So I'm going to kind of just jump into it. And one of the activities, so this is actually, if anybody's familiar with the program Project Alert, which is a drug and alcohol prevention program for 7th and 8th grade students, when I had worked with Lauren doing stuff within the Akron Public Schools, we actually took one of their lessons and we adapted it to make sure it was inclusive of gambling. And so since we have so many people here, I'm not actually going to make this an activity, but I do want to show you how you can utilize it. So similarities and differences between gambling and ATOD. If you're not familiar with the phrase ATOD, ATOD stands for alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. At least in the prevention world, that's usually how we refer to it. And the activity that we have done is really simple, but it's really great. You can use this with youth or adults. And this is something that you should be getting from Recovery Resources. They should be sending out these handouts, so don't feel like you have to write down everything. So this is just a really simple activity. So what you can do is, this is just a single sheet of paper. In the prevention world, we don't need to spend lots of fancy money doing things. So you can just print this off and then simply just cut each of these 4 phrases with lots of space for brainstorming into 4 sections. And the 4 different sections are reasons why people gamble, reasons why people use alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs, possible consequences of gambling, and possible consequences of using alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs. So in this activity, if you're doing it in a classroom, you can have multiple sets of these if you have like different groups of kids working at tables together. So you can have like 8 slips of paper versus 4 if you have multiple people working together. I've done this activity within the jails. I think that this is just a great activity just in general that people can either work on by themselves or with a partner if you want to kind of use it that way. And so what you do is you just say, hey, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to take a look at your section, so reasons why people gamble, and I just want you to brainstorm all of those different reasons. So I don't know if I can see the chat here at all. I'm not sure how to get there. Maybe Scott or Nabil can read me some things that you share. So if I said reasons why people gamble, can you write in the chat bar a couple of different reasons that you think people choose to gamble?
We have fun, a thrill, a rush, a high, relax to have fun, adrenaline, connection, a quick reward, looking for a big win, taking risks, excitement, loneliness, hoping to get more money, adrenaline, to be social, social connection, social activity, to make money, a quick fix or a need for distraction, hoping to win big, stress reliever, escape, excitement.
Awesome. That was a great list. That was fantastic. Okay, now let's switch gears. So if you were, for example, in the brainstorming group for reasons why people use alcohol or other drugs, in the chat bar, write down some of the things that you might brainstorm for that list.
Numbing, to have fun, to get high, relax, escape, to seem cool, relieve stress, have fun, excitement,
Excellent. Cool.
self-medicating.
Great. So now let's move on to our third one, which would be possible consequences of gambling. So go ahead and write some of those in the chat bar.
Lose your family, go broke, financial issues, loss of income, loss of money, ruined life, divorce, loss of job, loss of family and friends, depression, bankruptcy, illness, legal issues, domestic violence, good one, loss of mental health, addiction, loss of money, financial issues, embarrassment, violence, guns, fights, loss of important relationships, income, self-respect, loss of money, loss of relationships, robbery.
All right. Wow. Now give me, for our last brainstorming one, possible consequences of using alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs.
Poor health, incarceration, death, loss of job, health, death, legal issues, hurt other people, addiction, lung cancer, addiction, COPD, addiction, financial strain, family and legal issues, loss of relationships, self-respect, depression, everything previous for gambling.
All right.
Unplanned pregnancies, abuse of partners and kids.
Cool. All right. Well, those were all great. So what I will say is that if you were really kind of listening, so I'll go back to the sheet. So if you were really kind of listening to what everybody was sharing, so usually I don't have each group work on all four of those. I usually give each group one thing to brainstorm so that way people aren't overwhelmed. They can focus on one thing. And then we talk about it and we share those things out loud. And essentially, if you're really talking about and paying attention, it's very, very easy to lead a conversation in, okay, so if we take a look at reasons why people gamble and reasons why people use alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs, is there a lot of overlap? And the answer is yes. When we take a look at consequences of gambling or consequences of alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs, are there overlaps? Absolutely, yes. And so you can definitely lead that conversation. I like using a whiteboard in the background. It's really hard to do this virtually with you all, but I like using a whiteboard. I like writing all those on a whiteboard all at once and then having people make those connections. So what do you recognize is similar between all of these? What are some of the differences? And usually we see that with gambling, it might be a little bit more money and financially focused or driven. With drugs and alcohol, when it comes to the consequences, there's typically more of the physical aspects that people talk about, like COPD. But for the most part, when we really look at the base core of what's going on within drugs and alcohol or gambling, there is so much that is really similar to one another. And this is an activity that I will use, like I said, with young people who are able to make those connections and understand that, hey, drugs and alcohol is a risky activity. Everybody knows that. That's not a shock. But guess what? Gambling has a lot of the same things kind of going on deep down underneath. I also like to use this with adults because, again, adults tend to underplay gambling and say it's not a big deal. You know, nobody has problems or issues with it. but there could be a lot of the same concerns and the same consequences. And it's definitely a lot of times even we see like cross addictions happening. So this is just a really great, easy activity to help people understand that gambling can be a big deal for people. It can be addiction. It can be a problem that leads to long-lasting effects. So that's just a super quick activity that I like to use. So let's jump back in here. So activity number 1 is checked off the list. Went back too far. So when it comes to talking about youth or adults, talking to youth or adults, sorry, I don't know if you guys can see my thing. I'll just move this up here. So youth prevention message. So when Lauren and I first started talking to youth, we really discovered that you cannot necessarily have the same conversation with youth about gambling as you can with adults, and it's really important with how you word things and how you relate to them. So here are some of our takeaways that we thought were really important after having done some stuff for a while. So when you talk to youth just about gambling in general, and you're talking to teachers or principals or whoever it happens to be that you might be convincing that, hey, this is something you might want to address with your young people, refer to it as gambling awareness instead of problem gambling. Because usually people think, oh, youth, like they don't have a problem with gambling, like that's not a big deal. Again, it's underplayed. So just saying, hey, listen, we just want to make your young people aware of what gambling is and how it could potentially be risky. Again, we want to, just like with drugs and alcohol, we want to make sure it's a no use message. So we're not saying, oh, well, it's okay to, it's okay to play poker at your friend's house. That's okay. So we really just want to again come across and just say, hey, it's really not good to gamble. There could be some issues and some risks associated with it. Just like we wouldn't say, oh yeah, well, it's okay to, go and have some drinks at home when you're, middle schooler, like that's okay. As long as you're only having one, we don't say that. So we want to make sure we're giving that same message with gambling. A great tool that you can use with youth is also practicing refusal skills. So again, just like you would do a drug or alcohol prevention programming, talking about, how do you say no, or what kind of better ideas could you come up with to, tell your friends, no thanks, let's go ride our bikes, or whatever it happens to be. So practicing refusal skills around gambling can be a useful tool. It is really important to recognize, if you're not aware of this, that 4 to 5% of youth who are between 12 and 17 do actually have a problem. And this is, a typical classroom. 25 kids in a class is not crazy. It's not out there. And so 1 out of 25 of those young people is going to already be having issues and problems around gambling. We do also know that 10 to 14% are at risk for developing an addiction. Both of those last 2 statistics are higher than adults. And just like with drug and alcohol addiction, the younger that you start partaking in these types of activities, we see that brain development plays a huge part in how many young people start to have problems with it, just because their frontal lobe isn't formed yet. There's certain concepts like statistics and probability and odds, impulsivity, all of those kinds of things that can definitely impact young people at a higher rate. It is also important to know that whenever you are talking with young people, you have to recognize that most types of gambling is illegal for young people. But what we do usually see with young people are sports gambling is higher prevalence. Video gaming is huge. There's definitely a lot of gambling and gaming connected with one another. I would highly recommend, there's all kinds of webinars that have come up recently about gaming and gambling. Talking about loot boxes, talking about just how slot machines and spinny things and all those kinds of things. There's a lot of those things ingrained in a lot of gaming, so that's something to be concerned about and just be aware of. Phone apps. There's all kinds of free slot machines and all kinds of different apps that people can download to either play for free or be able to play with some money in a certain sense. And again, those are things just to make sure that you're more educated about. That could be that's a whole nother webinar, but that is a lot of times what we see youth engaging in, and even just dice or card games at lunchtime, at home, with family members, with cousins, whoever. A couple other things just to be aware of with youth is that a lot of times it may not involve money. At one of our schools, the big commodity there was hot flaming Cheetos. So that is just something that a lot of times it could be food, it could be candy, it could be shoes, it could be electronics. I have heard of young people who have been betting their cell phones. So those are things that when we are talking to young people, that's how we want to talk about it, is in language and terms that they recognize and that they might be seeing around them. If you're talking about casinos a lot with young people, they're going to be so like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I've never been to a casino. That's not relevant to me. Anything else that I want to say over here? Just again, that brain development piece. And again, the gambler's fallacy is, you know, how are stats or odds going to change with an event that really has nothing to do with it? It's complete luck. So if you have, like, for example, you know, a coin that you flip and it flips 10 times in a row and it lands heads, the person who has a gambler's fallacy is going to have a really strong belief system about what it's going to land on the 11th flip, because they assume that there's got to be a pattern with it. So they might say, oh, well, it has to be heads again because heads is on a roll, or they're going to be convinced that it has to be tails because tails is due. So they're going to have this belief system that's just not rational. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And unfortunately, again, because of brain development, we see that type of rationalization with young people. So when it comes to the adult side of messaging, we want to definitely refer it as gambling addiction. And I will say a lot of times when I'm approaching a group of people for the first time, a workplace, a nursing home, a athletic director, whoever it happens to be, I usually talk about responsible gambling. I'm not here to tell people not to gamble. I'm here to help them understand that there are ways to gamble in a responsible way. And that sounds a lot less forceful. People are typically more receptive to that. We definitely want to talk about what are those ways to gamble responsibly. The Set Before You Bet campaign has a lot of really great examples of what those look like. So typically talking about things like setting time limits, setting money limits, having a balance with other activities. It's used as just as a form of entertainment. It's not a way for me to make some income. We do also need to know that about 95% of the population can gamble without an addiction. So I will say that every single presentation that I do, my very first slide is, I am not anti-gambling. I am just here to let people know and to make people aware that there are people who gambling can become an addiction for. Most people can gamble in a safe way, but for everybody, that's not always the case. And so it's really about just letting them know that, you know, there are about 1% of people who do meet the criteria for a gambling disorder. If you are in the state of Ohio, my reference is that you can fill First Energy Stadium with all of those people and still have 8,000 people hanging out in the streets. Only 1%, but that's an incredibly huge number of people. And then we do know that also, in addition to that, somewhere between 2 and 5% are considered people who have problems with gambling, but may not necessarily fit into the disordered gambling realm. I already talked about not anti-gambling. Again, with adults, you want to talk a lot about odds, probability. Talking about things like casino or lottery tickets are typically the ways that I see our older population engaging. Talking about the business of casinos and lottery psychology is something that people are very interested in. So I would definitely recommend talking to Scott. Actually is really great about talking about psychology and whatnot. There's all kinds of different resources from Problem Gambling and Network of Ohio. So definitely do some research, and I would be happy to give you some of my resources as well. And really just talking about the signs and symptoms of addiction is incredibly important when you're talking with people and what that can look like. If you have like a DSM, a Diagnostic Statistics Manual, that's a great resource. Or again, even Set Before You Bet is a really great resource for talking about those signs and symptoms. One other message that I do with all of my groups as well is talking about how adults and kids, you know, if they have young people, if you have kids, if you have students, how does this relate to them and what you're doing with them? And so one promotion that the National Council on Problem Gambling does every year is actually about not giving kids lottery tickets for Christmas. And so that's a big light bulb for a lot of adults that I talk to who will say, oh, well, that was something that was normal for me when I was a kid, or that's something that I do for my kids, or my aunt does for my kids, or my mom does for my kids. And why is that a concern? And so it's, again, a conversation to have, to say, young people might be more at risk. And if they win some money early on, you have a 12-year-old who maybe wins $500 on one of their first lottery tickets that they've ever scratched. That can be a trigger. That could be a potential thing that leads them down a not so good path, because at 12, they may not understand odds or probability at that point. Their frontal cortex is not developed, so they don't really get it yet. And then beyond that, $500 to a 12-year-old feels like they're millionaires. Like they think they have all this money, and having money is great, right? Everybody loves more money. And to a 12-year-old who doesn't have a job or may not have anything else going on, that feels like that could be my source of income, and they might have false assumptions about how many more lottery tickets can I scratch before I win some more money. So something, again, just to make people aware of. In addition to that, there are definitely some games, board games. I grew up in a huge board gaming family, but it is really important to recognize that games like, for example, left, right, center. If anybody here has played left, right, center, essentially what happens is either people will put up items, or they'll put up quarters or dollars. And so you have this money sitting in front of you, there's a dice that rolls, and then it tells everybody in the circle, it's like a party game, everybody in the circle, do you pass your stuff to the left or to the right or to the center? And so everybody rolls it, and then you place your money, and then basically whoever's left with money, whenever it gets in the center, you can't get it anymore. Whoever is the last person standing gets all that money or those items in the center of the game. And so again, that's something that people could be using for fun. But again, if you have a very young person who wins a lot of money in something like that, could that potentially be a trigger for that young person? That's something that, again, we can be concerned of. So a workaround that might just be saying, you know what, we're going to play, but whatever's left in the center, everybody just gets their money back, at the end of the night. And then again, just awareness about video gaming, loot boxes, phone apps. All of those types of things, especially for parents, definitely say, hey, listen, if you have kids, make sure that your credit card information is not just in your PlayStation, so that way they can spend money on whatever and you may or may not recognize it's missing. So those kinds of things are really important to pay attention to. All right, so my second, I don't know, I can't tell if anybody has any questions. If you do, please write them in the chat. So let me know. Feel free to interrupt at any point. So, Scott?
Yeah, there's one question about everyone putting their money into a snack pool. And some concerns were raised about young people getting involved in fantasy sports.
Yeah, those are definitely, I would say, some concerns as well. And I do think that, when it comes especially to fantasy sports in particular, anything that's done online, usually the whoever is hosting that, right? So if it's like FanDuel, for example, they will say, oh yes, well, we have all kinds of things in place to make sure that the people are of age when they are using these sites. And usually that is a question of, when is your birthday, or how old are you, right? And so if I'm a 16-year-old, I could probably do some quick math, or I can just simply go on and sometimes they'll even be like, are you sure that you're actually over 18 because you put in a date that was wrong? So a lot of times it may be something that they can get around simply by lying about how old they are. So when it comes to fantasy sports, I do think that, especially for young people, they can get around it. So even though it is illegal for them to do that, even on apps, a lot of apps, again, will say, oh, are you over 18 or are you over 21? And they can, again, very easily lie. So those are things I think for parents to definitely be aware of. and that's definitely a good conversation for them to say, hey, listen, you should probably know what's on your kid's phone. And I think that especially as we see sports betting become legalized in the state of Ohio, we will also likely see some mobile betting and whatnot going on. So I think that might be something additional to address and make parents aware of once all of those rules and laws get into place, whenever it is probably passed. Okay, thank you for sharing. So let's move on to a second activity that I think is really great. So this one is called Ranking the Risk. And again, this is something that you can do with young people or adults. I really like doing it with adults, I think, a lot more, because I think it lends itself to a lot of conversation. And so with this activity, you're going to give them a list of different scenarios, and you're going to have them rank them from the most risk to the least risk of developing a gambling addiction. So I will show you what scenarios I usually have for them. Let's see. Okay, so this is the scenarios that I give them. And again, I will print this off. I will cut out each activity into a little slip, and then I actually stick it into an envelope. So I walk around with lots of envelopes. So I have envelopes, so all of these would be in one envelope together. And then usually, again, I will have people work in groups to do this. And I typically will say either rank them from top to bottom, or I will say, here you have a high risk category, a medium risk category, and a low risk category. And so however you feel comfortable doing that, I think either way is effective. So things like living 40 miles from a casino, playing bingo 3 to 4 times a week, a middle-aged mom who plans Saturday getaways to play her favorite slot machine, purchasing a lottery ticket every time you pump gas, placing a $100 bet on the Kentucky Derby every year, a 10-year-old winning $50 on the first scratch ticket ever given to him, having a parent who has a gambling problem, teenagers getting together once a month for a poker night, playing nightly online on a free gambling website, and placing one $25 bet on the NFL every week. And so I will allow them to take as much time as I think is appropriate, have them rank them as a group. And a lot of times within those groups, they have a lot of discussion. I like to walk around and kind of listen to what people are saying, because then I can relate it back to whatever I hear is kind of like the hot controversy in a certain group or another group. And then I will simply go around and I will ask every group to share what they thought, which ones they ranked as high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And I might pick a couple that I hear as similarities and say, okay, so group one, why did you pick placing a $25 bet on the NFL each week as a low risk activity? Or why did you pick, having a parent who has a gambling problem as high risk? And sometimes it'll be interesting, you kind of have to go with the dynamic of the group, but it's really about, if you're not a great processor, okay, side note, prevention note. So if you're not a great processor, 3 questions that you want to work through when you process. You want to ask what, so what happened, all the basics, so what, and now what? What, so what, and now what? Those are my 3 things. So, what did you guys experience? How was this process for you? So what? So, what does this mean? And here's what I will say. Sorry, I'm jumping the gun here. So what, now what? So I will say what happened, where were you at, blah, 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 blah. The key to this activity is that after everybody shares all their stuff and they say, here's where I'm at, you get to reveal to them that there's not a right or wrong answer. And then everybody goes, what? Oh my gosh, like this, why did you have us do this? And there's another great tool that I will also be sending with you to give you some talking points about why all of these things could be high risk, low risk, or medium risk. We just don't necessarily have enough information about all of these, but all of these could potentially be high risk situations. And even something like, placing a $25 bet on the NFL every week, if that's a 15-year-old who's illegally doing it and they're using their parents' credit card, guess what? That could potentially be a high-risk situation. So after they get this little, oh my gosh, all of these are potentially high risk, you kind of can talk about why all of these different things are high risk, low risk, or medium risk. Then the so what is, okay, so what can we take from this situation? And a lot of times people will talk about, you know, oh, well, you know, with gambling, it's really hard to know, you know, how people are experiencing it or what's going on. Some people will say, you know what, it's really just a complicated situation for a lot of people. People don't talk about their finances. It's not, you know, out there all the time. So there's all kinds of different things that they might take away from it. That's so what. And then the now what is, now what are you going to do about it? So, okay, so you've learned this information. So how can you apply that to what you're experiencing? And I'm thinking of my drug and alcohol treatment people that I'm typically doing groups with. So, you know, what are you going to take away from this? And a lot of times people will say things like, you know, that it's really important for me to recognize that, you know, if I have a family member or a friend, I might want to check in with them or talk to them about their gambling, or if it's a young person in my life, I might want to make sure that that's, you know, that they're not engaging in those types of situations and whatnot. So that's a really great activity that I really love, and it tends to just spark a ton of conversation. All right, so there's my little moral of the story. No right or wrong answer. All of those things could put people at risk. So one, I'm going to talk a little bit just about how you can integrate it really into all types of different programs, because yes, it is very much related to drugs, alcohol, and tobacco, but it also has a lot of context within the mental health field, within domestic violence situations, with those in poverty, and then especially with those who are in jails, those who are senior citizens, and those who are athletes. And I think that using data is really great, especially if you're like, oh, I really should be reaching out to people who are at high risk, who in my community might fit within that category. Being able to have some of this information is really helpful. So when it comes to drugs and alcohol, being at a treatment agency, I go into all of our drug and alcohol treatment groups on a regular rotation. And so I'm just kind of like a speaker, like we have somebody within the community who comes in and talks about like STDs and things like that. And I'm just a person who comes in and talks about gambling. And I share this with all of the consumers that I speak with, that realistically, there's a lot of studies that show that there's a lot of co-occurring disorders that happen. So about 75% of those who have gambling disorders have co-occurring alcohol use disorders, 40% have co-occurring drug use disorders. And I think it is really important to be able to relate it directly to what they're experiencing. So, you know, people who have gambling addictions can build a tolerance. And one of the examples that I have is last year I was in one of the jails doing a presentation, and a guy raised his hand and said, hey, listen, I know somebody who spends $800 every time he gets his paycheck on lottery tickets. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, like that's crazy. You know, it was a whole, everybody was like really up in arms around it. And so we had a conversation about how, you know, did that guy wake up one day and say, you know what, I've never bought lottery tickets before. Today, let's spend $800. Right? Like that's not how it happens. It's something that you build up to over time. You know, maybe he spent $100 every time that he got his paycheck for a while. And then he was like, you know what, maybe if I keep putting a little bit more down, I'll break even. So let's spend $150 this week. Let's spend $200. Let's spend $400. So that's something that he had to build that tolerance to be comfortable with spending that kind of money on lottery tickets. He had to know in his mind what made sense for him to spend to feel like he was going to get something back from it. Even though it's irrational and it doesn't make a lot of sense, that's part of the addiction. You know, it's something that he had to build that comfortability up to. When we talk about withdrawal, people who have gambling disorders absolutely can experience withdrawal symptoms. They can get headaches, they can have problems sleeping, they can have severe stress and anxiety, feel nauseous when they try to cut down or stop. Definitely in direct correlation with drug and alcohol addictions, that loss of control, not being able to set those limits, whether it's a time limit or a dollar limit, and stick to it. Preoccupation, thinking about it all the time, talking about it all the time, and even the consequences like we talked about earlier. We just see so much overlap with drug and alcohol addiction and gambling addiction. And so we also see alcohol use disorders and nicotine dependence really strongly correlated. So those are just some really great tools to be able to use, especially if you're talking about with people who are experiencing other addictions when it comes to alcohol and drugs. This was from our Ohio survey back in 2016, and this is another statistic that I use in all of my presentations. And so, you know, you can see that they took a look at people who don't gamble, people who gamble but don't have problems with it, and people who gamble and are considered at risk or problem gamblers. And they said, has anybody in your family ever had a gambling problem? 23% of at-risk or problem gamblers said, yes, this is something that my family experiences. And the second one is one that I use as a great tool. Has anybody in your family ever had an alcohol or drug problem? 47.6% of those who are at risk or problem gamblers said yes. And so I will use this as a way to say to anybody in my group, listen, you just sat through this presentation from me, and you might be saying, you know what, this doesn't impact me, or this doesn't affect me, and I don't have a problem. And I'll say, that's great. I'm glad that you don't feel that you experience this type of issue, but guess what? It could very much impact somebody that you love or care about that's really close to you. And so that's just something that you should be a little bit more sensitive and hyper aware of, because a lot of times addictions do run together a lot of times. All right, let me get this out of the way. Okay, so when it comes to mental health, I do a lot of stuff within mental health organizations, and there is a lot of, again, connection with mental illness and gambling. So when we talk about just depression and anxiety, those are probably the two most common ones. But then we also know that it has a strong connection with PTSD, which is why a lot of times veterans will typically have problems with gambling disorders. We also see bipolar, obsessive compulsive, and ADHD have connections with it. And then this is another study, you know, this one found that about 60% of people have personality disorders. What's this say, 50% of people have mood disorders, 40% of anxiety disorders that also have gambling disorders. And this last piece is something that is really just important as a whole to know, is that 5% of all suicides in the United States are related to compulsive gambling, as are 17% of emergency room admissions for attempted suicide. So suicide rates for people who are addicted to gambling are very high. They're typically higher than most other addictions. This is something that if you have ever had somebody call the problem gambling helpline, that they will always address, and they will ask if that person is actively thinking about suicide. If you are seeing clients that are addicted to gambling, this is absolutely something that you need to discuss and have a conversation with and be sensitive to as well. And so, you know, that's just something just so important that as we're talking just about mental health of people nowadays, especially with COVID, you talk about somebody who has high debt and is experiencing that, that could be something that we have extra concerns about. This is also from the 2016 survey. So quickly, you know, in the last 12 months, have you been under a doctor's care because of physical or emotional problems brought on by stress? And again, those at risk or who problem gamblers had about 20% who said, yes, that's something I've experienced. In the past 12 months, have you felt seriously depressed? 26.1% of at-risk or problem gamblers felt that. So again, just showing that we do see a really strong connection with mental health and gambling. When it comes to domestic violence, I think this is something that people typically don't think about. There was a really interesting survey in 2013. They took a look at 120 families that had problem gambling within those families who experienced some sort of family violence. And they showed that of the 120 families that they looked at, 52% reported some form of family violence in the past 12 months. That's a shocking number to me. That's huge. The interesting thing beyond that I find is that 20% of people reported only victimization, meaning that a family member or somebody else has been violent towards them. 10% said, I have been the perpetrator, where I have actually physically hurt, insulted, talked down to, threatened, or screamed or cursed at somebody else because of that. And 21% actually said that they had experienced both. So they actually were either the person who was the victim or the person who was the perpetrator. And I just think that's really fascinating. I'm not sure if that's common within a lot of other sectors or realms. But if you have domestic violence organizations in the community and they're not screening for gambling addiction, that might be something you might want to have a conversation with them about how they can add that to some of their services. When we talk about usually where that domestic violence lies, it's typically in a partner or an ex-partner or a parent. And then a lot of times we do see that the reaction is often something that is accumulated because of anger and mistrust. If they are the perpetrator and the victim is usually it's usually because of the gambler's anger that was brought on by gambling losses and frustration. So those are usually the reasons why that occurs. So when it comes to poverty, if you live in a more impoverished area, we do know that there are some studies around that. So there was a study that showed that 100% that there was 100% higher rates of gambling addiction in areas or neighborhoods with above average poverty. And they found that in this study that gambling problems occurred prior to homelessness 82% of the time versus it happening the other way around. And even when they took a look at just socioeconomic status as a whole, they found that it was highest for people who have low socioeconomic status, about 11.1% of people fit in with that category, versus if you have a higher socioeconomic status, only 5.1% fit within that category. Other specialized populations that I think are really important to try to reach out to in your communities. If you work in a jail setting, whether it's a juvenile or adult setting. So when it comes to juveniles, what I will say is there's a really fabulous curricula that's called Risky Business. So I would definitely recommend either reaching out to Scott or if you know Stacy Verhapnelhassen, which is a mouthful. So if you know either of them, they would be good people to reach out to, or I can pass along their information. It's a 6-session piece that is really great to use within the juvenile setting, and it focuses on not just gambling but other risky behaviors like drug and alcohol use. They talk about sex and things like that as well. And so if you have a juvenile detention center in your area, this might be a good thing to say, hey, can we come in and provide some sort of curricula for your young people. When it comes to adults, 1/3 of criminal offenders meet the criteria for having a gambling disorder. 50% of crimes by these individuals is reportedly committed to support their gambling behavior as well. So I, again, just go into my jails. I have 2 jails that I am involved with, and I go into them pretty much once a month and do a gambling presentation. They usually have speakers every day that come and speak for an hour. So that's another great place to go and reach out to. Senior citizens, a lot of times, we see it because they might be experiencing grief or loneliness or losing family members, spouses, people that they care about. And it can definitely be used as a way to cope or deal with those uncomfortable feelings of being lonely or being bored. We do also, in addition to that, see it actually linked to things like Parkinson's disease and restless leg syndrome. And it has nothing to do with those actual diseases. But some of the medications that people can be put on, one of the side effects is actually developing a gambling addiction. And so if you are working with people who may have some of those different types of illnesses, that is something to definitely make them aware of, their caretakers aware of, just to let them know that, hey, if you start seeing some of these types of behaviors, we might want to talk about switching medications. I will say that I also do reach out to our local nursing homes, and nursing homes can be really hard to reach out to sometimes, especially when it comes to gambling, because they may already have gambling bus trips that they may take. That is something very common in my area, and a lot of people like to gamble in their free time. And so coming to a nursing home and saying, hey, can I talk about gambling with the people that are there? It can get a lot of like doors slammed in your face, like, no, that's crazy, like we're not going to tell people not to gamble. And it's really, again, just letting them know that, hey, I'm not here to tell people not to gamble. I just want to give them some tips about how to gamble in a responsible way. And so, you know, again, making sure that you word it the right way, making sure that you kind of find the right people to have that conversation with. And I do think that whenever I talk to senior citizens in particular, I word it in a little bit of a different way. I'll say, okay, if you are experiencing this, or if your kids or grandkids are experiencing something like this might just be something to be aware of. And so it's kind of like shifting it off of, like, you're like, okay, I know you're at risk, but you know, let's shift it a little bit. And so they don't feel as attacked, or they don't feel like you're coming and saying, don't go to the bingo hall this week. So it's just an easy way to kind of have that conversation where it's a lot less threatening. And especially, another way, I guess, again, it would be just to reach out to caretakers and say, hey, listen, if you have somebody who is older, here are some of the things that you might want to be on the lookout for, and try to have conversations with those populations. Athletes also are definitely higher at risk, and especially with the new sports betting legislation that is likely going to be coming down the line, that's a great opportunity to be able to talk with young people about gambling addiction and what that can look like, taking a look at all like the NCAA rules around if they are allowed to gamble or not allowed to gamble, you know, and having that conversation with coaches or with parents. Just so that everybody's on the same page and understands what kind of consequences can happen. But we do see that typically those who are athletes just tend to be a little bit more competitive in nature. They may be more engaged in sports betting because they already are aware of it, and they know, you know, statistics and probability, and they might have gut feelings about who's better or who's not and whatnot. Okay. So that was all my big information, different ways to connect and reach out to different people. I have one final activity that I just want to share with you that I think is really great, and then I will definitely take questions, comments, anything that you are curious about that I talked about already. So my last activity that I do, and actually I do several more, but this is my last one that I'm highlighting, is what are the odds? And so I really like this activity with young people or adults again. And essentially with this activity, again, you're going to cut up the scenarios, and you're going to see a scenario and a probability statistic. You're going to cut everything up separately, place them in an envelope, and again, you can do this in small groups, so you're going to want to have multiple envelopes of that. And then you're going to ask each small group to match up the scenario and the probability. So let me show you what the heck I am talking about. So here's what I have. So I gathered a lot of these statistics online from different news articles and whatnot. And this is, I really like this activity. So talking about odds of winning the Powerball. So odds of winning the Powerball is actually 1 in 292 million. And usually this is something that I will give away before I do this activity. So I'll lead into this activity with a trivia question, and I'll just say, what are the odds of winning the Powerball? Anybody have any idea? And so people will throw out all kinds of crazy numbers, and then I will reveal to them that it's actually about 1 in 292 million. And I will talk about the concept that it doesn't really matter how many tickets that they sell. Those are the possible number of combinations that you can choose from. So when you go up and you say, hey, I want these numbers, you can choose 292 million different possible combinations. So that one's kind of a freebie. Then I will hand them these and I will say, okay, go ahead and work together and try to match these up. So cut all of these out as different slips of paper on this side, cut all of these out as different slips of paper on this side. If you want to be more organized, which I am not, you could print these on 2 different colors of paper, so that way all of the statistics are in blue and all of the odds of whatever are in red, or whatever colors you want to pick. And then you'll just have them match them up. And then it's just a matter of, after everybody's matched them up, it's revealing what are those odds. So hopefully they were listening and they get the first one right. A lot of times I find people guess these all over the place. I've never had a team of people guess these all correctly, but going down and talking about, okay, so anybody want to make a guess? What are the 1 in 55 million odds? So I'll usually go from highest to lowest, and then people will make all kinds of guesses, and then we'll move on and we'll say, okay, so what's the 1 in 1.19 million odds? What's the 1 in 960,000 odds? So I will go down that way. and just talking about odds of having quintuplets naturally is 1 in 55 million. So what does that mean? That means that you're essentially 6 times more likely to see somebody give birth to quintuplets than you are to win the Powerball. And people are like, oh my gosh, like that's so crazy. And so going down, you know, this whole thing, and they don't match up perfectly on the sheet, but they do when you match them up. And I will say the last two are probably some of my favorites. So the odds of dating a millionaire is 1 in 215, and your odds of becoming a millionaire yourself through work and investments is 1 in 55. So I think that those are just really fascinating. And so we're able then to have, again, those processing questions of, okay, so who got 1 right, 2 right, 3 right? What statistics were you surprised by or not surprised by? And what can you take away from this activity? So that's my kind of what, so what, and now what. And I find that a lot of people will usually, their takeaway is that, oh, well, this, you know, it's way easier just to be smart about your money or to set aside that money that you would have spent on lottery tickets or the casino or whatever, and be able just to set that aside in an investment account or in a bank account or start up a business or whatever it happens to be, and actually earn that money than just hope and pray that someday I'm going to be the 1 in 292 million that wins the big money. So that is some of the stuff that I like to use. And I will just say in closing that if you are doing gambling education with any type of population, I would definitely recommend just being creative, thinking outside the box. Even with you're working with adults, adults love interactive activities. I do a trivia game in some of my groups. I do a couple of different things from a program called Stack Deck, which is really great. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can kind of break up just monotony in education. I think as a whole, when you're talking about gambling, relating it just to risky behaviors in general, and addiction in general is really important because, I mean, it's all connected with each other. You know, people in the prevention world will say prevention's prevention, is prevention. And so we just want to talk about, you know what, these are risky behaviors, and it might be something that you might just want to have this conversation with people in nursing homes or athletes or whatever is about. So just wording it that way. Again, just being conscious about messages that you're sending to youth versus adults is really important. I'm happy to send over some of my youth-based resources as well if anybody needs that kind of information. And then really just being creative about promoting it to different populations or people that you work with. So if you are in the prevention world, if you do marketing, if you are somebody who's just reaching out and doing education in general, think about who might be high-risk populations in your area and be creative about ways to reach out to them to provide them some information. So that, in a nutshell, is all of my fabulous information. I'm going to see if I can maybe stop sharing my screen.
Excellent presentation, Claire. If anyone has any questions, you can type them into the chat and I can pass them along to Claire. We're getting a lot of great job, very helpful, good job, great presentation. A lot of great comments. While you guys are engaged in those, I want to remind you that the Cuyahoga Problem Gambling Coalition has another one of these scheduled for the 22nd, next Thursday from 11 to 12. That will be Understanding Gamblers Anonymous. And then the following Thursday, the 29th, from 11 to 12 will be the neurobiology of gambling. Those are both really great topics, and it's a lot of really good information. I'm sure that those of you that are just starting out in the field just found out that there's a whole lot more to this gambling thing than just lottery tickets. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of information and it's very, very interesting. It's a fascinating disorder. I'll also remind you that an evaluation will be sent to you for this presentation. Please fill that out and send it back, and that will be how you obtain your CEUs and your credit for being here with us today. More great jobs, Claire. More fabulous, great job, great enthusiasm, wonderful knowledge. Thank you, great presentation.
Awesome. I did say somebody asked about the PowerPoint. I'm happy to share my PowerPoint as well. I can send that to Nabil, who can send it out. And I will just say, Scott did a little bit of a plug for the next webinars coming up. I will do an additional plug. So I also sit on the Cuyahoga County Problem Gambling Coalition. So we are actually the only problem gambling coalition focused in the entire state of Ohio. If you are somebody who would like to join us, we are absolutely accepting new members. So we are generally located in Northeast Ohio. So if you work in Akron area or Lorain area, Cuyahoga County, Lake County, Geauga County, Ashtabula, even Youngstown, and you would like to reach out to us and join us, we have quarterly meetings, and it's just a great way for us to connect. We plan activities like this every year, and we also are going to be talking about Problem Gambling Awareness Month, which comes up in March, and how we can all partner together to make our communities more aware and sensitive and get people more help.
A number more of congratulations and great presentations. I just want to mention you can reach me at scott.anderson@mha.ohio.gov if you need any of the information that Claire talked about on risky business or how the survey was conducted or anything like that. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And also the Problem Gambling Network of Ohio, pgnohio.org, pgnohio.org. There's great resources there about upcoming trainings and things too.
And I did see Nabil reminded me that we do have a knowledge check question coming up in order for you to get CEUs.
Okay, let's do that. Wow.
I'm glad everyone was paying attention.
Somebody was paying attention. Okay, we've got about a minute left on the evaluation knowledge check, and then want to thank Nabil for letting me tag along today. It was great seeing a lot of names I recognize and seeing Claire and hanging out again.
Absolutely. And I will again be sending out all of the activities and my presentation, and I'll make sure I have Nabil send out my contact information as well. So I've been doing problem gambling prevention and education for 7 or 8 years. So if anybody has any questions or wants to partner on a project, I'm all about it. Yes, there should only be one question. Okay, well, I guess just thank you everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone.